Good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Mark Thomas. Education funding is a hot topic with this year's candidates. A new report suggests one plan could be costly for Nebraska students and communities. 3 News Now reporter Alex Whitney has the details for us tonight.
School funding debates are a constant in Nebraska politics, and this year's gubernatorial race is no exception.
Every Nebraskan, no matter their circumstances, should have a shot. But our schools are not set up that way. Some districts receive additional funding, while others, they're left to fend for themselves.
The additional funding that he mentions is equalization aid, which is determined by the TIOSA formula. Of the $1.07 billion in school funding being allocated this year, around $880 million is equalization aid. That only goes to 86 out of 244 school districts, serving around 78% of Nebraska students. Pillen wants to see that change and spread it equally on a per-student basis, but a new report shows that idea might lead to a reduction in funding for most of Nebraska's students.
So when we look at the implications of that, what we see is that for the school districts that educate about 78% of students in the state, potentially they would have a funding loss of about $270 million.
Open Sky Policy Institute is the think tank that authored the report. The consequences of per-student funding wouldn't just be felt by students, but likely property owners as well. Open Sky's analysis found that the average property tax levy would have to increase by 41 cents to cover the difference in lost funding. Pillen and his campaign, though, aren't convinced by the report, and in a statement to KMTV said in part, "When you make as many assumptions as this back-of-the-napkin analysis does, you can arrive at whatever conclusions you want. Entrenched interests want to protect the TIOSA status quo, but the status quo isn't working, it isn't fair, and it contributes to higher property taxes." The threat of higher property taxes are part of why Pillen's opponent, Democrat Carol Blood, doesn't support a per-student system.
And what's going to ultimately happen is you're going to see pockets of really high increases in property taxes. And that's not an opinion. That's a fact based on the math that he presents with his idea.
Blood is also critical of the TIOSA formula and wants to see it replaced, but says a simple solution like per-student funding won't work. Ultimately, the decision to change the way that funding is allocated will fall to the legislature, but Blood says it's impossible to ignore the influence a governor can have on legislation.
You know, it's been clear, especially over the last 20 years, that whoever sits in the executive branch can be a guide to some of the best or the worst laws that have been passed here in Nebraska.
From Omaha, Alex Whitney, 3 News Now.
Voters will have a chance to decide between both candidates' policies on Tuesday at the polls.